everybody, this is Amy Mesney from Amy Mesney's Teaching Ideas for You. I am here today to talk to you about how to use formative writing effectively in your content classroom. The examples I'm going to give you today are to use writing in social studies, but you could use the same topics or not topics, but the same types of activities in, say, a science classroom or a math classroom. So these ideas are just ways to give you ideas on how to integrate writing so students are writing more frequently and that the writing is helping students to increase their achievement in your class. So yesterday we talked about summative assessments, and summative writing assessments are your final assessments where you are assessing students for mastery. The formative assessments are what we use to check students' understanding as we go through a unit. So before we continue on to a new lesson, we check to make sure that they understood the main ideas in the lesson that we just did. So a lot of times you can use writing in order to check the student understanding. And it's a quick write. It's not, we're not writing essays unless it's a summative writing piece. So these are quick things that you could have students do in class, at the end of class, as a bell ringer. It just depends on how long your class is and how you organize it. So let's talk about how you can use this writing effectively. One thing that we can sometimes do is make things too routine. And with these formative writings, we want to mix them up a little bit. We don't want to just always have the same type of question or the same type of writing because it becomes old. And then students start to disengage, or they start to just do it to get it done because they've done it so much. So it's good to have a few tricks in your bag and then just rotate through them, because you don't want to do a new type of writing or a new type of prompt every single day, because then you're constantly having to model to students what you expect. But if you can develop, a bag of them, so to speak, where you have, say, 5 to 8 different types of writing, and so you introduce one and you model it and you practice it, then you introduce the next type and you model it and you practice it. So slowly throughout that first semester, you're building students up to know what to do if you give them one of these types of assignments. That way you can vary it up and students stay engaged. The other advantage of having different types of writing, as far as formative writing goes, meaning for different purposes or different types of prompts, is that you will reach more students. Some students might be great at summarizing, where some students might be better at, say, creating a cartoon or a poster and then describing what's going on in that. So if you vary up what you expect, you're going to hit the strengths of more of your students. So let's talk about some of the ways you can use writing. Formative writing can be used as a self-assessment. You want students to start to use their writing to realize what they know and what they don't know. So we're using these types of self-writing or self-assessment writing to build metacognition. So this is something that you're going to have to model for students, in that if you ask them a question, what is it that they know? What question do they still have about the material? Because students don't always recognize what they don't know. Sometimes they do. Some students are very naturally self-reflective, but some people aren't. So this is something that you could model. As I am writing in my journal, when I model, I might say, we're talking about U.S. geography. Well, I know that there's 5 regions, and I really know my region well. I know the Southeast really well because I live here. I lived in the Northeast. I don't really know so much about the West, and the West is such a big place. So I could model aloud the types of questions that I still have as I'm creating this sample journal entry with the students. So it's just a way to show them how they can also put notes in there, still want to know X, or I want to ask the teacher X, or when we discuss it, can we talk about this? Like, they can make notes like that in there to remind themselves of what they don't know. So some ways you can think of these self-assessments. You could use an interactive notebook and then have the kids put their short writings in there. A lot of people will do a left page and a right page. You don't necessarily have to do it that way, but you know, when I do interactive notebooks, like I really like interactive notebooks, I would definitely keep everything in one. I like personally to have the simplest system possible. So I have found that no matter what grade level I taught, the more separate pieces we had, the more likely stuff would get lost. So that's one way you could organize it. You could also do a binder, you know, whatever system you are already using for your notes, I would somehow work these journals into that. So some examples could be an exit ticket, a bell ringer. It could just be a question you put up on the board and you have them copy the question into their notebook. You know, like I said, when I do these things, I glue everything into that notebook. So if I give them an exit ticket, before we're done with it, it'll be glued down fast so they can come back to it because I want them to save it. Another thing about having this self-assessment at the end of a lesson is you can help students to dig deeper into what they understood. You know, so I really understood this well, or I want to ask questions about it yet because I don't quite get it. A self-assessment quick write can also help you to bridge the lessons. So let's say you had an exit ticket at the end of the period, and the next day you put up a quick journal prompt to do as a bell ringer. It could be some sort of question that bridges yesterday's lesson to today's lesson. So you can use these formative writings in order to help kids make connections. So another way that you might use writing is as a quiz. Now, when we look at formative writing, this will be a quick write, but you'll take it as a small grade. So if you were with me for scoring versus grading, scoring is done with fewer points. It's done more on effort versus, you know, perfection. So what I would be looking for is, are they starting to understand it? How well are they understanding it? But I might do a quick write out of 5-10 points because I'm only probably looking for about a paragraph or so. So, you know, you would focus your quick write on whatever your main idea was. So if you've been talking, say, about how the Industrial Revolution and how new inventions affected westward expansion, and you've talked about that for 2 or 3 days, like you might want to give them that question. So how did new inventions and new technologies influence people or help to cause people to move west? So that might be what you ask them, and you just tell them, you know, I don't want to know everything you know, but I want you to tell me, you know, what do you know about these technologies and their influence in a paragraph? So you want students to use their vocabulary. So maybe they talk about Conestoga wagons, or maybe they talk about the telegraph. So they're reusing their content vocabulary in this quick write to help them learn the vocabulary. So depending on your grade level, my brother teaches high school, so he has taught elementary through high school. I did a little bit of high school, but high school was not where I spent the majority of my teaching career. So I look at more like upper elementary, middle. You would want to create a rubric for this. So if you're a lower grade, like you might want to do 0 to 3 on the rubric, an upper grade might do 0 to 5. And so 5 would be like you nailed it. You got most of the key points. You have a very deep understanding. So a 4 could be you understand it. You did a good job explaining it. You know, you just have to make up your rubric. And again, I would model that at the beginning of the year. Now, the goal for you would be to have students self-assess this writing. Because again, the best thing you can do for students is to teach them how to assess themselves. Did I get it? Am I still having trouble? You know, how are things going? So I would probably start modeling this type of formative assessment early in the year. I would have that rubric that I could use for the entire year. So once you have kids used to it, then you can say, okay, we're going to do a quick write, and then you can put the rubric up and have students, you know, judge their own writing. How well do they understand it? So then what my brother does with that type of assignment is he just goes around with a clipboard and he writes down everybody's score. You know, if you're in elementary, you might want to collect them up, but it just depends on the age of your students and your class time. So another way that you can use formative writing is as a student resource. And this is why I glued everything down in my class, because you have some super organized kids. You've got the kid who will lose everything, including his notebook, and most kids are somewhere in the middle. But if you keep everything in there and you keep it organized, these formative writings become a resource for when they have, sorry, the cat is visiting, for when you have your summative test or your summative assessment. So that's why I keep everything locked down. I would either hole punch everything and put it in a binder. I would glue it down, whatever your system is. But you want to show kids how if they do a good job going through on these formative writings, that it will benefit them when it gets to the summative pieces that you do, because they'll have all the information that they've gathered throughout the unit. So I always tried to show students in my first big unit how the better your notes were and the better your classworks were, the better your homeworks were, then the less you had to keep going back into that giant textbook. Because especially for your reluctant readers, they want to see that it pays off in the end. You know, to have to reread the whole giant chapter is a lot of work. I mean, going through your notes is a lot of work, but it's a lot less than having to reread the chapter over and over again to find the ideas. So I always tried to model that and really, you know, impress that on the kids. And you'll find that some of the kids that catch on to it right away start to influence the ones that haven't quite figured it out. And it becomes a better system for your class. So let's talk about one of my brother's favorite ways to use formative assessment. Now, he has taught every subject in elementary school, and he's also done this with social studies and with English. He's teaching high school English right now, but he swears by a reflection journal. I personally really like interactive notebooks, and I would put these reflections in my interactive notebook. So you have to find the style that works for you, but what he really enjoys is using a reflection journal. So again, think about how you organize your class, because I think every teacher has to use what works for them. Some people really don't like interactive notebooks. They don't work for them. For me, I love them, and because I also lose everything, like if I don't keep it locked down. So for me, it was perfect. You know, you might have a class where you have a kid that needs special accommodations and uses some other type of organization. So whatever works for you, you as a teacher, find your style, and then when that works for you, just stick with it. So how can you make this work within whatever your system is, I guess is what I'm saying. So again, reflection journal, like for me, I could put them on, say, the left sides of my interactive notebooks. My brother keeps it as a separate piece. I know some teachers who use those 5 subject notebooks, and then this would be one subject area of that notebook. So all the reflections would go in one section. You know, you might have a binder and you have dividers, and that goes in there. So just kind of think about how you could make this work for you. So the nice thing about the reflection journal is it does all the things that we just talked about. It can be a self-assessment. It can be a quiz, and you just go around and, you know, check the scores. It could, and then it also serves as review pieces for, so as a something the students can use to help study and reflect on. So it's going to help students build their metacognitive skills because they're using this reflection journal to think about their learning. So the other thing in the content areas that we want to do, especially when we're dealing with the Common Core standards, is we want to get students to write regularly. And we want to show students how writing can be an effective tool to help them with their learning. So if you write often, then students are going to start to see how to do that. And again, you know, a lot of kids think every time they write, it has to be a 5-paragraph essay. But you and I both know the reality is we often use writing for a lot less than that. A grocery list, a note, an email, a letter. I mean, not as much with letters anymore, right? But, you know, an essay is just one type of writing, and probably one that you're not going to use as often in your daily life as these other ones. So these formative writings help students to develop like this daily writing skill. It also gives time for students to think and reflect. So that can be a big thing because, again, you have some kids who kind of live in their own head and they reflect a lot. That's a personality trait. But then you have some kids who need that quiet time to reflect. And often in a busy classroom, we don't always have that much quiet time for kids to just kind of think to themselves, especially think of your introverted, your really quiet kids. So having 5 minutes built into your class where everybody's quiet and focused on what did they get out of today's lesson can really help those kids. And then for your kids who are not naturally reflective and have a harder time focusing, having that quiet time without all the distractions can help them get on point a little bit more and focus. So let's talk now about the different types of reflection journal entries. I think summaries is one that most people use. I mean, we teach summarizing in early grades, so I know we're starting that, third, fourth, fifth grade, where we're leading them into pulling out the main idea and writing a summary. Summary writing can be really difficult for kids, so it is a skill that needs to be taught, especially, if you are teaching that period, like third, fourth, fifth grade. So you want to make sure they can identify main idea, and then you want to move into modeling summaries. So by the time they get to middle school, they really should know how to write a summary. If they don't, then you're going to have to help them get up to speed. But the nice thing about summarizing is they have to identify the main ideas. They're probably going to have to use your content vocab because they're going to connect your main ideas. And they can check this really easily. So if you had them write a summary as their exit ticket, and so at the end of class, they have 5 minutes, they have to reflect on what were the key points for today. Tomorrow, when you are taking attendance, you're going to have your answer key up there, and they're going to check their answer. Did they get all the main parts of the summary? Did they get some of it? What did they miss? Who has questions? So you have time to take your attendance, and then you're going to take a few more minutes to say, okay, so let's talk about the summary. And so then you can quickly review the previous day's lesson before launching into today's lesson. I mean, that's just one idea for how to use it. So, I like that because I know in the elementary classroom, I was teaching 4th and 5th grade before I started homeschooling. And we barely had time for social studies to start with. So that was a nice way to wrap up. And if they didn't finish it in class, it went home for homework. But then I could go over it at the beginning of class and it wouldn't take all that much time. So another type of entry that you could use in your reflection pieces are the essential questions. So have students write how the lesson connected to your unit's essential question. So if you're doing culture, like maybe you're on Native Americans, and you want to start talking about what is culture. So maybe they have to reflect. So from this lesson, what did they see as part of culture? If you're talking about what is the purpose of government? So what did we learn today about either somebody's perspective on government or what in the United States Constitution we think the government should be doing? So they have to make connections back to that main idea, that essential question, because your essential question is going to be a question that gets kids to focus on the core idea in your unit. Again, with this essential question prompt, students should be using their content vocabulary. You're trying to get them to use this domain-specific vocabulary in their writing. And if you create rubrics, I would make that part of the rubric. Did they use the vocabulary? Because we can teach them the vocabulary, but if they don't use it, they're not going to learn it like they would if they used it regularly. So an essential question prompt can really give you an idea of students' depth of knowledge. How deeply are they understanding your lesson? Because if they're giving you a surface piece where they just kind of parrot back the ideas, they may not have understood the deeper inferences and things like that. So you know, as a teacher, you can use that essential question to kind of see how well are they understanding those main points. So let's talk about inferences. Inferencing can be another type of journal entry. This is when students process and draw conclusions about what they've learned. So you might ask them to do cause and effects. So like maybe you've talked about a situation. So let's take Shays Rebellion. So you talk about the rebellion itself. So then you might not get into what comes next, but instead ask students, so based on Shays Rebellion, what do you think is going to happen in the country? Like, what do you think the founding fathers are going to do, the government leaders? You know, how do other people react to that event? So think about how you can use these reading skills like cause and effect and inferencing together, or you could think about just connections. Because in social studies, I always told kids, everything in social studies is like a chain. So this is one link in the chain. So what do you think that next chain link is going to be? Or how do you could also say things like, how do you think this group will react? You know, so you could get them to think about points of view. So these are things that you would want them to infer. So based on what you learned, how are Native Americans going to feel about colonists moving past the Appalachian Mountains? You know, think about ways that you can get kids to learn how to reflect on what they studied and pull more facts out of it without having to be told. And again, I would really model inferencing, because for a lot of kids, this is difficult. They have to think deeply. So it's, unless it's your kids who are just naturally really interested in that topic, you know, you might have to help pull them along and demonstrate the thinking process. And so the nice thing about inferencing, it does take longer for you to review it as a teacher. So when you're going over that to review how the class did, or if they have questions, you're going to find you're going to have different inferences from different students. And you're going to have to talk about, well, are they all valid? Or could they have been valid, but historically what actually happened? You know, so it's not as cut and dry as the other two that we just talked about, as summarizing and the essential question piece. So with inferencing, you might end up having some good discussions with that. So again, the inferencing can lead you into point of view. So the nice thing with point of view is you make kids really think about things that have happened and how they affect different people. And especially with history, that can be a good thing, because if you're textbook based, the textbooks do not always do a very good job of diving deep into multiple perspectives. I mean, I think what I have seen, at least in my textbooks, is once in a while they try and talk about, well, women this and Native Americans that, or enslaved people this. But I mean, they're almost like side notes instead of part of the main lesson. And so this is a way where you can have kids thinking about this, even though it may not be a feature point in the lesson. So it makes kids think about other people's perspectives, not just their own. They also have to realize that they don't have to agree with those points of view, but that's a valid way of thinking. Like, this is how they feel about it. You may not agree with it, but it's their perspective. This is a higher level thinking skill. And so again, you're going to have to demonstrate this. As you get older and as kids get better at this, you can ask them to do more than just one or two points of view. So it is a skill that you can expand upon. And this is a really effective writing piece to get people to be, or to get your students to be more empathetic with other people, and to actually understand that you can have different points of view, and that's okay. And that you need to respect people's different points of view. You don't necessarily have to agree, but you do need to respect that. And I think with today's climate, especially of what I see online and how people talk to each other, I think this is a skill that teachers really should focus on more, because obviously somehow we've lost it in a lot of our social media discussions. So the last type of writing that I want to talk about is compare and contrast, or comparison writing. We've already talked about, other basic skills, and I would call compare and contrast a skill a pretty basic skill. We're doing this in primary grades and slowly building on it so that kids can do it at a deeper level. And compare and contrast is a great writing piece when you have multiple perspectives, multiple people, multiple events, multiple themes, and you want the students to compare them. So I think I mentioned this in a previous live this week about, like, I would have kids compare the different colonial regions to understand how they developed differently, to understand how the attitudes were a little different in the different colonial regions. If you're teaching ancient history, this is really a good thing to do. You could say, how were the Greeks and Romans similar and how were they different? Compare the Babylonians to the Sumerians. And it's just a good way for kids to pull separate lessons together. And it's a great way to make kids continue to reflect upon previous knowledge so that they're not just learning and dumping. So again, students aren't being asked in compare and contrast to agree with one side or the other or pick it, but they're trying to explain what they know about each one. And again, you want the kids to include text references and content vocab in their writing. So you're trying to get them to be specific. The more specific, the better the reflection is, the better it's going to be for them when they go to review. So I appreciate everybody coming and being with me with these. And so from today, it's Thursday the 26th, I put all the resources that have connected to the mastery grading and the integrating writing on sale through Sunday. So these are things like, as you see behind me, that way, the standards posters that I put up. I have standards posters available for both Florida standards and Common Core standards. But you post them in your classroom in order to help kids to get focused on what they're supposed to be learning. This is your unit goal. This is what you're trying to learn. I know many schools require them, and I know when I was trying to handwrite them every few days to change them out or type them up and having to look them up, it took so much time that I just typed them out and then printed them off and stored them in a binder, and I would just change them in and out. It was so much faster. Some of the other things that I have for formative and summative writing to integrate social studies and writing together, because especially if you're elementary, if you don't integrate it, you almost can't fit it in. I wanted to show you how I integrated it for myself. So I pulled out a couple things to show you, and I'll run through them really quickly. Our district did away with textbooks, which sometimes textbooks are handy to have, and they went to newspapers. Now, some people like the newspapers and some people don't. I made, for American history, I made flipbook units. Now, if you aren't super spatial, these same lessons I have included in this unit in full lesson pages and a folded book, and I also put them up on the Google Drive. But each lesson or each unit comes with multiple lessons. So this one is my geography lesson because this is my first unit in 5th grade. So we would talk about latitude and longitude so we get their skill, and then I would include the activity to practice the skill. And then you would move on. We have to talk about relative and absolute location. Sorry, I'm trying to find the camera and where it's best. So you can see as you go through here, each one focuses on a different topic in the geography standards. And so by the end of the flipbook unit, if you're in Florida, this unit actually would cover all of your standards. So I have these for all of the American history for upper elementary through right before Civil War. So westward expansion up to Civil War. So you can see each of these, it has sometimes a map, sometimes it has a writing activity. So this is how I would teach. Say I would work on close reading, my informational text, and then I would also take in skills. So here they do the US map. They have to identify the states and the capitals. So I have my unit because I like to have a unit versus just newspapers coming in. So that's how I would teach the material. Now, in addition to that, I would get through with that, and I know that we have our writing test. So I also have writing prompts that go with paired passages. So what I did for geography is, I'm in Florida, so I wanted to focus on something that integrates skills. So I created paired passages where I would teach close reading with these. So I have 3 different passages, and this one happens to focus on Florida's environment. So my overarching writing prompt question is, how do people affect the environment? So what I did is I would choose whether I wanted my students to just start out with one passage, or we might read one and analyze it and do the reading comprehension test. So I would teach close reading. Again, I'm going to talk about pulling out the main idea or whatever skill I'm trying to teach with these. And then what I would do is, after we read, I would probably start with 2 to teach, especially if you're 4th grade, because this is a new skill for kids to read across multiple texts. Then I would take them to the writing prompt, which is an extended writing prompt, and I would teach them how to organize an essay using multiple texts. So I use this after we get through the unit. So this is kind of like my bridge from one unit to the other. So I finish one unit, and I'm going to take the time to use paired passages so I can review those reading skills, but also practice for that writing test. Because a lot of people wait to do the writing practice until like the 2 months before the test. And honestly, you really need to start that much earlier in the year if you really want your kids to do well on it. They need multiple practices. And it's really helpful if you have texts that go along with what they're supposed to be learning, so you can hit multiple standards in different subject areas. So another thing I had that I would do is, as they're doing the unit, this is my formative assessment. I made these because I always had trouble coming up with a formative assessment at the last minute. So I made exit tickets. So I made these to go along with all of the units, but these are pre-made exit tickets. So I have 2 on a page. And what I did with them is I went through the HOTS questions, the higher order thinking questions, and I pre-wrote these questions out so that I know when we get through the latitude and longitude questions, or, I talk about the prime meridian and the equator, I can have this ready to go and put this out for the exit ticket, and we're going to go over it. If they want to practice I want them to practice map skills. We've talked about this. Here's an exit ticket on that. And then sometimes I get into that short writing like we just talked about, the quick writes. What is relative location? Give an example of this. What type of location do people use when they give directions? So I did this just as a time saver for myself, because I want my formative writing, my formative assessments to tie into what I've taught for the day. Now, if you want to, you could use them as morning work, homeworks. You could use them for bell ringers. You could use them for spiral review. Like if you have a state test, we don't take tests on social studies, but if you do, you might want to pull these out. But this way, instead of me trying to look at the lesson when I'm planning on the weekend or whenever I'm doing that, like they're already done for me. I just have to find the page that goes with my lesson. So I have my lessons. I have my formative assessment done. The lessons do come with a summative test. So I've already got the summative test, but the paired passages I'm not counting as a summative writing, because it's not writing based on what they've learned in the unit, because they're having to use the text-based evidence. So I'm including that simply because I know we need to practice it. That's such a big skill, and they need it when they get to high school. So the better we can prepare them in upper elementary, the better it'll be for the high school teachers. Now, if I have time, and sometimes I did this and sometimes I didn't, I do have a research project that I would use as like a summative writing prompt. But this takes time, so it just depends on how much time you have to dedicate to it. Do you have the need to teach a research project? But what I did is I would have students review the regions. So we talked about the regions in our geography unit. So then students had to fill each page out. Now I would do one region at a time. So like this is the Northeast. So I would have them select on here, which 2 states do you want to go visit? And they'd have to talk a little bit about what types of things they'd like to do. So let's say they said that they really want to include Pennsylvania on their trip, because what they're doing in this research project is they're creating their favorite trip. Like if they could design a trip to take with their family that went through all the regions of the United States, where would they most want to go? So I include a research note page for every single state. And so I had my students research 2 places to visit in each one of their states. So this project does 2 states, 2 things in each state, and in the end, they're putting together their trip. Now, if you're short on time, you might have them pick 1 state in each region and 1 place to visit, or you could have them work with a partner, or you could have different groups do different regions and then have them work together to make the final part of it. If you have kids present their trips, because we would have an open house and present these, now you're hitting your speaking and listening skills as well. So if I'm teaching how to write the bibliography, because I know that's something that we started to teach, I also included in here a page on how to write the bibliography. So this I tried to fit in, 1, because kids really liked it. 2, they also have to use after they do their research on the state, they have to use what they've learned about the different regions because they're writing up what they saw. So I like to use this because I can hit so many standards with it. So you can see I've got my unit, my formative assessments, I've got my summative test, I've got a summative writing, and then I've got my extended essays, my text-based essays that I have to have for writing for my writing test. So I've hit so many standards, but just in 1 unit, and I could do all of this in my language arts class. Like that was my goal. Now I know one thing that we had to teach in my grade level was we were supposed to get them to learn the 50 states and the 50 capitals. And honestly, we were happy if we got them through the 50 states most of the time. But I decided to create like an early finisher activity or a center activity. And these are just clip cards. So let me show you. I have these, so they have all the states. So what they would do, students would take these and they would say, okay, what state is this? And the choices are here. So I think it's New Hampshire. So I take a paper clip or a clothespin and I put my clip on what my answer choice is, and I flip it over and it tells me if I'm right or not. So I have my clip on the colored box. That's the correct answer. It also helps students, I'm holding it upside down, sorry. It also helps students learn where it's located because the answer key shows the location of the state on the US map. So they're practicing their recognition of the state outline, and then they're also practicing where is it located on the map. And I also made these to move kids on to capitals. Once they finally learn their states, they can move on to capitals. And I have had some teachers tell me they actually make sets of these because all you do is print them off on cardstock. I would laminate them to use them in the classroom because they'll last pretty well forever. But they actually send them home as extra practice for kids who need it. So this, again, depending on how your classroom is set up, you can use it as a partner activity. You can use it as an independent activity, an early finisher activity. You can send it home as homework practice for kids who just need it. So there's so many different ways that you can do it. But these are just samples of some of the resources I put on sale for you, as well as the ICANN standards posters and the data checklist for like data folders. So there's standards checklists. And again, the posters and checklists are available for both Common Core and Florida standards. And if you buy any of my products and you have questions about them, I am very responsive to questions and I will gladly help you out with them. So my name is Amy Mesny. My TPT store, my Teachers Pay Teacher store, is just my name, Amy Mesny's Teaching Ideas for You. You can also connect with me on my blog, on Facebook, on my Instagram. I have a YouTube channel. and I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.